Okay, so the very first thing you want to do before you pin and cut your pattern in fabric is to iron it. You want to make sure that you move the iron slowly so that you can get out all of the wrinkles in the fabric. You can iron either side of the fabric, either the right or wrong side. You can also do both sides to make sure that all the wrinkles are out and your fabric is prepared to be pinned and cut. Now you're going to prepare your fabric to put your pattern on. So make sure that you fold your fabric in half. You're going to want to fold it so that the nice side of the fabric, or what we call the right sides of the fabric, are facing together. So you want the wrong side, or the duller kind of ugly side, facing you. Make sure that you really smooth your fabric out like you see me doing, so that you don't have any wrinkles, and then so that no fabric is folded underneath by accident. Now you want to place the bottom of your pattern along the fold of your fabric. So where the arrows are pointing on your pattern, make sure that that bottom there is lined up with the fold on your fabric. And then you're going to pin your pattern to your fabric. You're going to want to make sure you use a good amount of pins, 3 sort of fingers between each pin. If you use your hand there, is probably about good enough. You want it nice and secure so that when you're cutting your fabric out after, nothing slips or moves around. Now you're going to start cutting your fabric. While you cut, make sure that you keep the bottom of your shears against the table. This will help you have smoother cuts that aren't all jagged along the edges. So start by going nice and slow. There's no need to rush. You want to make sure that you're cutting right along the edge of your pattern. Nice sharp cuts. Next, you're going to transfer the pattern markings from the pattern onto your fabric, and you can just use a marking pen or pencil for this. Just gently lift up the pattern on your fabric and mark down where the do not sew area is. You don't really need to mark down the 1.5 centimeter line, because you'll be using a 5/8 seam allowance later on, which will line up exactly with that 1.5 centimeter line. I also like to shade in the do not sew area a little bit darker so that when you go to sew your seams, it's a lot more obvious and you'll pay more attention to where you need to stop so you don't sew there. If you want, you can also use a ruler to connect the two sides of the do not sew area, but you don't have to do this, it's your choice. If you're choosing to do a pocket, make sure that you iron your pocket fabric similar to the way that you did with your bag fabric in step 1. Make sure that you get out any wrinkles or folds in the fabric. Next, you're going to pin your pattern onto your pocket. Make sure that you fold your pocket fabric in half, again with the nice or the right sides facing together. Make sure again, like you did with the bag, that you place the pocket pattern on the fabric so that where it says on the fold, on the bottom of your pattern is lined up against the fold in your fabric. And then again, similar to the way that you pinned your bag pattern, just pin your pocket pattern the same way and start cutting. Now you're going to pin and stitch the top of the pocket. So fold your pocket with the right sides facing together and line up the top edge. That should be the edge that is the opposite of the fold in your fabric, and pin that edge. So make sure your pins are perpendicular to the edge of your fabric. As you can see, the fold is near the bottom of my hand, and where I'm pinning is the top edge of the pocket. Now you're going to sew a regular straight stitch where you pinned the top of the pocket. So line your fabric up with the 5/8 line, start stitching forward and then reverse and then go forward again. Remember to take out the pins as you sew, and when you get to the other end of the top of the pocket, make sure that you backstitch again. Now you're going to turn the pocket so the right sides are facing out. And then you're going to just fold down the sides of the seam you just sewed, as I'm doing here, similar to how you did it in your seam sample assignment, and press that seam that you just sewed. At this time, you'll also want to press down the fold of the pocket. This will just help prepare you for the next step. Now you're just going to sew another straight stitch, so pattern A on the dial, across the top of the pocket where the seam is that you just sewed. Line your fabric up with the 4/8 seam allowance line, and you can just sew all the way across the top. Although I do back stitch here, you don't actually have to for this stitch, because you're going to be folding the sides over and sewing over it anyway. You can back stitch if you want, but you don't have to for this part. This part is a little bit trickier. So you're going to take the sides of your pocket and fold them under 1/2 inch. So use your seam guide, set the little red slider to the 1/2 inch, so 0.5 of an inch. Sorry, my arm is blocking this a little bit. So you're going to fold it over that 1/2 inch and use your seam gauge to measure as you go down the side to make sure that it's the same width the whole way through. And as you go, you can pin it as well. You might want to do this on a table, not on an ironing board like I did. Because a table is hard, it's easier to pin. If you try pinning it on the iron board like I'm doing, the pin may get stuck in the ironing board fabric underneath, which is just kind of going to make it a little bit harder for you. So once you're done one side, do the other side of the pocket. So these are the open ends of the pocket. This is not the seam that you sewed or the fold of your pocket. This is the other two edges. So I'm doing the same thing on the other side. I'm using my seam gauge at the 1/2 inch mark, and I'm just measuring the whole way down to make sure that my fold is the same width the whole way and that it's not wider on one side or narrow on the other, because we want your pocket to be a perfect square, or rectangle I should say, not a square. That's a rectangle. After that, you are going to press it with your iron. Try not to melt the little plastic balls at the end of the pin, so kind of go in between. And we're going to press it again so that it stays folded over a lot easier, because you're now going to have to pin this pocket to your bag fabric. So once you're done pressing, take the pins out. Give it one last good press, just for good measure. Flip it over one more time, and you're ready to pin it onto your bag. Next, you're going to put your pocket on your bag. Make sure your bag fabric is unfolded. Pick one end of the bag, and on the right side of the bag fabric, you're going to center your pocket with the top of the pocket facing up and the fold at the bottom closer to the fold of the bag. Make sure that you measure from the side of the pocket to the side of the bag fabric on each side so that you can make sure your pocket is centered, as you can see I'm doing here. You can use a seam gauge or a tape measure. The seam gauge is nice, remember, because you can slide the red piece and get an exact measurement. Once you have centered your pocket, begin to pin the sides and bottom of the pocket. Remember to place your pins perpendicular to the edge of the fabric, so that means they're not running lengthwise along the edge of the pocket fabric. It's the opposite way, as you can see I'm pinning here. You may or may not want to pin the top of the pocket. Where you sewed the seam earlier, that is the top of the pocket, and you don't want to sew through that because then you don't have a pocket. So we only sew the sides and the bottom. If it helps you to remember not to sew the top, then just don't pin it, and you know you're done by the time you get to the last pin. Next, you're going to sew your pocket onto your bag. So make sure that you line your fabric up with the inside edge of the presser foot and start in the top right corner of the pocket on pattern A on your selector dial. And as you normally do, you're going to sew forward, backward, forward. And take your pins out as you go along. Make sure that you take them out again before they get to the needle, because you don't want to sew over them and accidentally lose an eye. So you're going down the right edge of the pocket first, and when you get to the very end, remember how to pivot. So that means your needle is down in your fabric, and you lift your presser foot and then turn the fabric. So now I'm continuing along the bottom, and you can just shove all that extra fabric in the middle of the sewing machine there. So then you're going to sew along the bottom until you get to the bottom left corner of the pocket. And same thing, put the needle down and turn your fabric. Now, I didn't go quite far enough, so I have to play around with it here a little bit and go back and forth just to make sure my seam allowance is correct when I pivot and go up the left side of the pocket. So now I'm going all the way back up, heading towards the top left corner of the pocket, taking the pins out as I go. And when I get to the top again, just like I did when I started, I'm going to back stitch a little bit by pressing down the reverse lever, and then front stitch. Make sure you don't go too far off your pocket. going to zigzag stitch the top ends of the bag fabric, so make sure that you turn your dial on your pattern selector to C. And at the top of the bag, you're going to line your fabric up with the outside edge of the presser foot. And then you're going to sew forward, backward a little, and then forward again. And for this, you don't need to pin anything because you're not sewing two pieces of fabric together. Okay, we're just individually zigzag stitching the tops of the bags. So you do it to one side of the bag at the top. So that's the opposite side from the fold, where you're later going to fold your bag in half. Okay, so then you flip it over and you sew the other top side of the bag fabric. Now you're ready to fold and pin your bag. So make sure that you fold your bag so that the right sides of the fabric are together. That means the dull or the wrong side of the fabric is facing out towards you. So you're going to pin the sides of your bag and make sure as usual that your pins are perpendicular to the edge of the fabric. So that means the pins aren't running lengthwise along the edge of the fabric. It's going the other way, like you can see I'm doing here. Make sure that you are pinning on the side of your fabric that you made your pattern markings on. So you want to be able to see that do not sew area. And when you're done pinning the first side, don't flip your fabric over. You just want to rotate it like I just did. And then pin the other side. Again, you want to be able to see those markings where you are not supposed to sew. If it helps, you might also want to just draw over it a little bit darker with your marking pen or pencil, just to make sure that you are absolutely sure you know where not to sew. Sometimes I also like to put a pin right at where I'm supposed to start and stop sewing, just to help me remember not to sew there as well. Now you're going to straight stitch the sides of the bag using pattern A on your selector dial. Make sure you line your fabric up with the 5/8 seam allowance line on your throat plate. And you're going to start sewing forward, and then you are going to back stitch, so hold the reverse lever, and then sew forward again. So you're going to sew until you get to line E on your pattern legend, and then you're going to do a back stitch. I'm just trying to be very careful I don't go into the do not sew. So I back stitch, forward stitch, and then stop at line E. You don't have to take your fabric out for this part. You can just make sure your needle is up, put your presser foot up, and then slide your fabric forward until you get to line F. So you've skipped over the do not sew area, and now you're going to sew straight, back stitch like I'm doing here, and then you're going to continue on down to the end of the bag, again making sure that you remember to take those pins out before you get to the presser foot, because we do not sew over the pins. When you get to the end of the first edge, make sure that you back stitch again. Now you're going to sew the other side of the bag and make sure that you rotate the fabric. You don't want to flip it over. So instead of starting at the top of the bag for this side, you're actually going to start at the bottom of the bag and sew to the top. So again, you start with your forward stitch and your back stitch, and then you're going to continue sewing, and you don't have to worry about the do not sew area quite yet because you're starting at the bottom of the bag and your do not sew area is at the top of your bag. So make sure that you remember to take out the pins as you go. Now remember that when you get to line F, you don't want to sew through the do not sew area, so you're going to back stitch and then forward stitch and stop at line F. And similar to what you did last time, raise your needle and your presser foot, slide your fabric forward over the do not sew area so that you're lined up with line E. Drop your presser foot, so you're going to forward stitch, back stitch a little bit, and then continue forward stitching all the way to the top of the bag. And once you are at the top of the bag, that is when you are going to back stitch again, and then you are done with the two sides and you're ready to zigzag them next. Now you're going to zigzag stitch the seams that you just sewed in the last step. So turn your pattern selector dial to C, which is the zigzag stitch. I like to line my fabric up with the outside edge of the presser foot because I find that it puts your zigzag stitch right in between the edge of the fabric and the seam that you just sewed in the last step. So remember that you're going to forward and back stitch in the exact same places that you did for your straight stitch in the last step. That means that you have to skip over that do not sew area again. So remember to raise your needle and your presser foot when you get to that area and just slide your fabric forward. But also remember that you do have to forward and back stitch whenever you start or stop in that do not sew area. This part is a little bit trickier. You are going to take the top edge of the bag, so edge B on the pattern legend, and you're going to fold it over on the E line so that it lines up with the F line. So you want the little openings to be on the inside of the bag right now because the bag is still inside out. So you're going to fold that top edge over, as you can see I'm doing here. And then you want to use your seam gauge to make sure that it is the same width the whole way around. But the same way that you used the seam gauge for your pocket, you're going to use again. So I folded the top edge over and I pinned one part of it there, just so I knew how wide I wanted it. And now I'm using the seam gauge to just measure the width and make sure it's equal all the way around. And as I do that, I'm just pinning. Make sure that you don't pin both sides of the bag together by accident though. You only want it to go through one layer of the bag. And again, you are pinning perpendicular to the edge of the fabric. You're not going along the lengthwise. So just make sure that your top edge B is lined up with edge F, and you should see the little openings on the inside of the bag. Once you finish pinning the top, you can press it. You're going to do this in very similar fashion to the way that you did the pocket. You can use one of the little ironing board arms there so that you are able to stick it inside of your bag. And again, just try not to melt the little plastic balls on the edges of the pins if your pins have those. This is just going to help keep the top flap down and creased nice and sharp for you as you sew. I promise it's going to make things a little bit easier. At this point, you might also choose to press down the seams that you sewed earlier. So as you can see, I'm just folding it over to one side of the bag and pressing it, and then I'm doing the same with the other seam. This will just help it lie flat. Now you're just going to straight stitch the top fold on pattern A. So I usually like to start near one of the seams just so that the stitching is a little bit more hidden. And for this, I actually lined up the left edge of my fold. I lined it up with the outside edge of the presser foot, but on the left side of the presser foot this time. So you want your stitching fairly close to the edge of your fold, but not too close. So lining it up either the outside or even inside edge of the left side of the presser foot should be good. Make sure that when you start sewing as usual, you do a forward and then back stitch and then forward all the way around. And then when you get to the end again, you want to back stitch. Again, make sure that your seams are straight and that you're guiding your fabric. Okay, now this is kind of the fun part. This is where you're going to put your drawstrings in. So tie one of the ends of your drawstring into a little knot. If you don't do this, then it just happens to fray a little bit more. So you're going to stick your safety pin right through the drawstring. Don't put it through the knot. You actually want to stick the pin into the drawstring itself. So you're going to start on one side of the bag and you're going to feed the safety pin through one of the holes in that do not sew area that helped you create the tunnel. Okay, so you're just going to push the safety pin along inside the bag and pull the fabric so that your drawstring follows. Now, don't forget you have a little hole on either side of the bag where the seam is. So you want to start with the first drawstring and end in the same hole. Okay, so you're going to start and you're going to pass the hole on the other side and then you're going to go right back to where you started. Okay, so now I have gotten back to the original hole that I started in and I'm just wiggling and pulling the safety pin out with my drawstring. So now I have both ends of that one drawstring coming out the same hole in the top of my bag. And the next thing we're going to do is repeat the same process, but for the other side. So you can just tuck the drawstring into the bag for now, so it's kind of out of your way. And then again, knot your other drawstring, put your safety pin through again. And then this time, you're going to do it a bit different. You're going to start, oh, watch me just struggling with my safety pin a little bit. Way to go, Mrs. McClure. All right, I think we're good. Okay, so now you're gonna start in the hole on the opposite side. So you're gonna do the same thing you did with the first one. You're going to use your safety pin and guide it through the tunnel in the top of the bag. So you're starting and finishing in the same hole. Okay, so you're gonna go all the way around the bag and just be mindful that there is another cord already in there, so there's sort of less wiggle room now. So you'll have to be very careful as you pass the first drawstring you put in and the other side where the first hole was, and then you're again going all the way around back to the hole that you started, and you're going to pull the second drawstring out from the hole that you started in. Okay, so we're just about there. If you happen to lose your safety pin while you're in the middle of stringing the drawstring, like let's say the safety pin unclips somehow, you can just pull the drawstring back out from the way it came and then start again. So now I'm pulling pulling the drawstring back out of the same hole that I started in. Just gonna even out the drawstrings, and then again you can tuck them just inside the bag. sew the corners. So using a straight stitch, so A on your selector dial, you're going to line the edge of the fabric up with the outside edge of the presser foot. Forward stitch, back stitch, and forward stitch again, making sure you remove the pins. When you get to the drawstring, make sure that you are sewing fairly slowly because that area is a bit thicker. We just want to be careful that we're not jamming the machine or getting anything stuck. So sew slowly over that area and then continue on the other side. And when you get to the end, as usual, you're going to back stitch just to secure and lock your stitches. Once you've done that, remove your fabric, and then in the seam, so between the seam you sewed and the edge of the fabric, you're going to forward and reverse stitch just a few times over the drawstring specifically to really secure them. Zigzag stitch, so C on your selector dial, you are going to zigzag stitch the seams just the same way you did for the side seams of the bag that you did earlier. So again, make sure you forward and back stitch at the beginning and end, and then also remember to go slowly over the drawstring area. You're just about done. Your last step is to press the seams that you just sewed. And then after that, you can turn your bag right side out and you are done.